Hiya, welcome back to the Fennel Shed again. We're here today to do part 5 of our block of the month, which, although it's part 5, it will complete part 4. So I've called it a Lodestar because a Lodestar is one that you look to for direction, and this star has a diagonal that echoes the diagonals that are beginning to form in the center of our quilt. And once it's set into place in the corner, it gives the direction to the log cabin elements. So the good news is every element of this repeats techniques that you've already learned earlier in blocks 1 and block 3, but I'm just going to go through all the elements so that you know which bits go where. So in our cutting instructions, it shows you, or tells you rather, what fabrics to use. And for this Lodestar quarter block, we use fabric number 1, our background, fabric number 2, our softest contrast, which has just got a little bit of detail in it, fabric number 6, which is your zing, and that's going to be your star points, and fabric number 7, which is almost as dark as we go, and it's going to make up that diagonal divide that gives the direction to the star. So what do we cut? From fabric number 1, we cut 4 1/4 inch squares, and we need one of those per block. So we cut 8 squares that are 4 1/4 inches to make the background of our flying geese that gives us our star points. In addition, we cut a strip that is 2 inches wide, and from that we subcut all of our little 2-inch squares that make up the corner squares for 2 of the corners. Then we cut a strip that is 1 1/4 inch wide, which is combined with the fabric number 7 to give you the tiny little 4-patch corners that make up the other 2 corners. And that's our cutting for fabric number 1. For fabric number 2, we cut a 2-inch strip, which is combined with fabric number 7 to do the central 4-patch. For fabric number 6, which is the star points, we cut a strip that is 2 3/8 inch wide, and from that we subcut, we actually cut 2 strips that size. We subcut 8 sets of 4, which is 32 squares in total, of your 2 3/8 squares that are your star points. We've already talked about having one strip of fabric number 7 to make up the large center 4-patch, and one strip again of fabric number 7 that is just 1 1/4 inch wide that combines with fabric number 1 to make the tiny little 4 patches, and that's all your cutting done. But that's all done in detail on the list. But those of you who are getting your kit will get those pieces all ready to cut out. So once we've done all our cutting, we can go ahead and make all the different elements. But the first one we need to do, as we did before, is our star points, which are again flying geese. And people ask, why flying geese and not just half square triangles? But if you use half square triangles, you end up with seams in the midst of these instead of having a clean piece of background. And I think the clean piece of background is much nicer. It also means you have less bulk, where the center, the inner angle of the flying geese comes to meet a corresponding seam from your 4-patch. You want to minimize the bulk that there is at these junctions. So the flying geese unit looks an awful lot better, it works better, and it actually uses less cloth, so it's even more economical. So that's several good reasons for using flying geese rather than a combination of 2 half-square triangles. And so, quick rerun of how the flying geese are done. You set your two of your contrast squares face down onto each of the large white squares, sew each side, cut through, open flat and press, and repeat for the other 2 corners, and that way you'll make your flying geese. For the 4-patch, we sew our strips together, both the narrow ones of fabric number 1 and fabric number 7, and then the wider ones for the center 4 patch of fabric number 2 and fabric number 7. And when those are done, we end up with our pairs of strips. Pairs of strips we put right sides facing, as in part 1. Right at the very start we did this at part 1, and instead of cutting lots and lots and lots of small squares, we cut the strips, then we sandwich the strips together, the dark onto the lighter and the lighter facing the dark. And in the pattern, I'll remind you, make sure that this middle seam just nests totally comfortably into itself, and then mark for the wider one at 2-inch intervals, for the narrower one at 1 1/4 inch intervals. Cut those slices. So you sew 1/4 inch away from the marked line, and then you come back and you cut on the marked line. So I've got my ruler here on the marked line. That's for the bigger square that makes up the center, and these are the tiny ones. So you can imagine how tricky it would be just to cut those tiny pieces here into individual squares. And instead we've got this lovely clean piece that we can sew in and back and in and back. It's so much easier. So this technique not only produces a better quality of 4 patch, it also saves all your joints on your thumbs and on your wrists from doing a lot of pincer. So the sewing process is so much easier and so much less of a strain on our bodies. So our little small 4 patches, we turn over, we open the seam and press them, and we end up with guys this size that fit into the corners. And we repeat that process for the bigger ones that fit into the center. So now I'm going to take a set of my flying geese back to the sewing machine just to do a quick reminder on how that process is done. And then once I have all these elements, my corners, my 4 patch corners, my 4 patch centers, and the flying geese, once I have a full set of those made, I'm going to show you how to sew those together to create the quarter block, and then how that quarter block gets joined with the other 3 quarters to finish these blocks. Now, before we go any further, I'm just going to do a quick revision of the technique that we used for making the flying geese, because these are a different size from what you've used before. We want to end up with a star center that is 3 inches finished size. So our background square was 4 1/4. These were 2 3/8. You put 2 of them on the opposite diagonal corners, overlapping in the middle. Mark your mid line, the diagonal line, and sew 1/4 inch on each side of that diagonal line. Once you have it stitched on each side, press it and then cut through the diagonal line, and you'll end up with 2 pieces like this. When you've got 2 pieces like that, you take them to your ironing board and you press these guys out the way so that the light is tucked in behind the dark. And then what you've got after that is that piece pressed, and the final contrast squares go on to the exposed corners, diagonal line marked again. Those are stitched 1/4 inch. I usually use these little points, it's almost like a W here, and so you use the valley of the W to be your indicators of where your 1/4 inch seam should start. So once you have that one stitched, you've got your 2 lines down there, you split that, you open it out, and you end up with a set of 4 of these matching. So you begin with 1 big square and 4 small squares, and you end up with 4 of these with no waste. But what you do have is a little bit of play in terms of the finished size, and you also have these protruding corners that you want to remove completely before you move on. So in order to do that, this unit should be exactly 2 inches top to bottom and exactly 3.5 inches side to side. So one place that you don't want to remove anything from is here. You need your 1/4 inch seam allowance here of your feature fabric. So you don't want to take a wallop off that. All you want to do there is to trim away this protruding piece and make sure it's level and straight. And that's all that comes off there. Then you turn that round and measure that the outer edge here is 2 inches away. So we're using the lines on the ruler. You could also use your lines on your board to give you a guideline and come along 2.5 inch parallel to the baseline where your feature fabric is, and you take away anything that is outside it. Then side to side, this needs to be 3.5 inches wide. But it's not just any old 3.5 inches. It has to be 1 3/4 from the center to the outside edge in both directions. So we use the ruler in all kinds of ways here. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1 3/4 takes me to the midline. I make sure one of the cross lines on my ruler is along the base edge, that it's not going off at an angle either way. I make sure that the 45 degrees is running along that edge, and then I know, yeah, that's the right place to cut, and I trim that side away. And then I turn it around and do the same for the other side. This time I can measure from here to the edge is 3.5, from the center to the edge is 1 3/4, keeping it straight, and you end up that these, which are quite untidy units, become these, which are very tidy units indeed, and your blue contrast has to run right out to the corner in both sides. So when you have those done in sets of 4, you are then ready to put your block together. Right at the beginning, we made our little 4 patches with fabric number 7 and fabric number 1, and these all go diagonally. We made our centers with fabric number 7 again and fabric number 2. Remember, they don't go that way, they go this way, diagonal all the way through. And our 4 trimmed flying geese create the star points, and then we have 2 opposite plain corners as well. Now I'm going to sew these, and I'm going to chain piece them. So I'll do the vertical seams first, and then I'll go across the way. So I'm going to take these, but you can leave me for a moment while this noisy machine is on, while I sew. Okay. So we begin by sewing a chain from the top to the bottom on this side. So we close these over. 1, 2, 3. That keeps everything in the right position. And if you like to, by all means, put in your pins to keep them in place. First, the second is here. Paying particular attention to where the seam on the reverse of the flying geese, that it doesn't twist back on you as you sew it. And the third section down here. And having tried this a number of times, I have found that it's best to press this seam in towards the middle, these seams outwards from the middle. And now checking again, oh, this is twisted, so make sure that this diagonal is running all the way along before you sew that piece on. Make sure your flying geese are pointing in the right direction. So that goes on there, this goes on here, and this one goes on here. Pin and back to the sewing machine. And again with all of these, an accurate but slightly scant 1/4 inch. Now, I have chain pieced my vertical seams, and this one will be pressed outwards, this one will press inwards, and this one outwards again. So on some occasions finger pressing is enough to allow you to proceed on to the next stage, and your next stage, once you have checked that everything is where it needs to be, is to come back and stitch this one in place, this one in place, to complete the 1/4 block. And now my Loadstar 1/4 block is made, and it needs a good iron before I add in my log cabin elements. Now I'm just doing a check on this for size and trimming it to a more accurate 6.5 square, and taking away any uneven edges that have accrued as the piecing was going on. So this runs diagonally across, and then our 3 log cabin 1/4 blocks are set into place to echo the same diagonal. So again, we close over that center seam as if we were closing the book. now I have the two top to bottom seams done, and the way that these seams will be folded will be dictated by this star square, because it really wants to be able to fold itself out. There's so much more detail in it. So you fold this one towards the log cabin, and these are two equal sides, so that can happily go in the opposite direction, and press those before you introduce them to each other, making sure that that's nested exactly at that center line junction. Put a pin in it. Where that has been chain pieced, trim that little loop. Allows you to open this and open that center seam and press your 4/4. And that's your completed Loadstar and log cabin block. We make 8 of those, and now I'll show you where they fit on your quilt. So now I'm ready to put the first pair of these log cabin Loadstar blocks in place to show you just how effective they are when they're added onto the center of the quilt. So they're kind of like the shoulders of the quilt, and this was way back, this was block 1, and now you can see the purpose of this diagonal, that it links in to the log cabins, and your extra log cabins that you've left over when you've all of these block made will be right out here onto the border of the quilt to turn the corner and carry the eye back down again. So this will be repeated top, bottom, left and right to make this beautiful big log cabin diamond frame that completes the central part of the quilt.